We're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome all of you to the What to Expect During Your Stage 1 webinar. My name is Joe Krolikowski and I'm the Technical Director for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So I do invite you to use the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the conclusion of our presentation. One of the most common questions that we get is, will we be able to save this presentation? Well, we do make copies of the slides available for download shortly after the presentation is complete. And if you'd like to watch this presentation again with the voiceover, that will also be available shortly after we're finished. Both of these can be accessed on our website under previously recorded webinars. Our topics for today, we're going to address why there is a two-stage certification process. We will review kind of the flow of the stage 1 process, quotation phase, what happens prior to the stage 1. I've got some slides on what happens during the stage 1. I call that stage 1 front to back. We're going to highlight some things in the stage 1 audit that can prevent continuance to a stage 2. How to respond to the various recommendations, some concluding remarks, and then your questions. Now, as to why we have a two-stage process. Well, PJR is an accredited registrar. We are accredited by ANAB, UCAS, and some others. And the primary standard that is used to assess what PJR does is the ISO 17021 standard, which is presently in a 2015 revision. Now that standard includes a clause that reads in part as follows. The initial certification audit of a management system shall be conducted in 2 stages, stage 1 and stage 2. Now the standard goes on to elaborate on what they want looked at during the stage 1 audit. And that, of course, informs our workbook and what we tell our auditors to look at and how auditors are trained on stage 1s and so forth. So everything kind of flows from that 17021 requirement. Now, the reason why, besides just that we are told to, is we want to make sure that when we send an auditor to do the certification assessment, there's a significant investment there. We're sending an auditor usually for a number of days. We've aligned other resources. We want to make sure that it's really only those companies that are truly prepared for a certification assessment. So the stage 1 audit, it's shorter. It looks at some key items, and we can kind of separate who's ready from who isn't ready in terms of proceeding on to that stage 2 assessment. So that's why we do a stage 1 in the first place. Now, you must obviously be a PJR contracted client before we can do a stage 1 or any other audit at your facility. Now, in the early phase, we have an application. And we have a series of applications actually that are referred to as the F1 series of documents. And they are intended to help facilitate our initial contact with the client and make sure that we're getting the right kind of information. The F1 series, there's a lot of layers there, a lot of information. And the more that we can gather in advance, the more competitive our quote can be. Obviously, we realize that the cost of certification is very important to you. We want to try to extend whatever discounts are reasonable. We do have to stay within special requirements from the International Accreditation Forum, or IAF, and that is mandatory document 5. This is a document that talks about how much time we need to spend on an audit, not just a stage 1 audit, but surveillance audits, recertification audits, and so forth. IAF MD5 stipulates that the maximum amount of time we can discount is 30%. So if you're looking at registrars and you have one registrar that's giving you a particular set of numbers based on the information you've provided, and another registrar that's giving you a dramatically different number, you need to be careful and look at, well, are they accredited? Because this IAF MD5 is a mandatory document and applies to all certification bodies. Now, once we've got you under contract, you will be assigned to an audit program coordinator. Now, you'll probably refer to this person as a scheduler. And the scheduler is going to be your primary point of contact here at Perry Johnson Registrars. They're going to manage you cradle to grave, so to speak. The schedulers are required to ensure that you get an auditor that's qualified in your standard, competent in your technical area also. What that means, for example, if you have a very specialized industry, if you work in laboratory analysis, or if you work in nuclear fuels, we want to make sure that the auditor we send has some basis for understanding what they're going to be looking at, or else the audit's going to have reduced value. So from that aspect, we look very carefully. Now, obviously, we want to make sure that you're getting an auditor that is geographically friendly as well. Obviously, if you're in a large city, that's easier to accommodate. If you're in Chicago, if you're in Detroit, if you're in Dallas, if you are in a remote area, obviously we look at travel costs. We do try to be as reasonable as we possibly can. Now, before the stage 1 audit takes place, you are going to be sent a document called the F-108. Now, the F-108, again, these are scope specific. It is essentially a document that you fill out and say, yes, we are ready for your stage 1 assessment. We concur that we have all of the things that we're supposed to have, and we'll be ready for the stage 1 assessment. So here's the list of things that the F-108 is going to discuss. Now, again, there's going to be some other items on here in certain scopes, but this list is universal. You have to know what your scope is. You have to know what your what the activity is that you're seeking certification for. This is particularly relevant if you have a limited scope, a narrow scope. You have to know what your exemptions are, what your exclusions are. You have to have determined what your processes are. You have to know how those processes interact with each other. You have to know what your process measures are. We call those KPIs, key performance indicators. You have to have put together some performance data to show that you're tracking those KPIs. PJR Form F-191, we're going to be looking at that in a few slides. You have to have assembled your internal audit documentation, determined that your internal auditors are competent, management review, outsourced processes, statutory, regulatory, and required documentation. So there's a lot of things that you're committing to, and if you can truthfully answer yes to everything on that F-108, then your stage 1 audit should be a success. Now let's talk about this F-191. This is a document, it's a grid, and we send it out in advance of a stage 1 audit, and sometimes it comes back as a point of confusion. So let's get into the intent of this document. It is intended to help you ensure that the processes that you've established for your quality system, taken together, are going to represent a fulfillment of the clauses of the applicable standard. Additionally, we use this as a planning tool for the stage 2 audit so that we know, okay, what are your processes and so forth. So let's take a look at how this is put together. Let's say that this is the representation of the organization's processes. Now you'll note in the lower left-hand corner, we have 6 named processes here. We have sales order entry, we have purchasing, production, shipping, quality, and support. So we know now that this company has 6 processes. And there are those 6 named processes. Okay, so taking on the role of the organization now, how might we organize these on the F-191? Okay, so here on the left-hand side, we have those same 6 processes, and across the top here, we have the 10 sections, or excuse me, the 7 sections of the ISO 9001:2015 standard. This is also going to be the clause structure for any NXSL based standard. And this organization has indicated, for example, for clause 7.1, they have flagged production, quality, and support as the processes that they've established that fulfill section 7.1 and everything in 7.1. You'll note that the column for section 8.3 has been left blank. Oh, excuse me. The intent there, presumably, is that they've excluded section 8.3. We can probably conclude that they are not product design responsible. So again, don't be overly confused by this. Essentially, we want to know what your processes are, and those should line up with your interaction of processes document. And then we need just a firm affirmation that all of the clauses of the standard have been addressed by the processes that you've implemented. Okay. So let's progress now. Let's talk about the actual stage 1 audit. Now, typically we do stage 1 audits on site. We do permit off-site stage 1s. For simple ISO 9001 quality management systems. There is a savings in travel cost. However, it does typically work out to more total on-site time. Regardless of how the audit's going to be conducted, you should expect to be contacted by your auditor at least a few days in advance of the stage 1. And you should absolutely receive an audit plan. It's important for you to confirm that the information on the audit plan is correct and let your auditor know if it isn't. If the address is wrong, if the scope is wrong, all of these things are going to be spelled out on the audit plan. Now, when the audit actually commences, like any other audit, it begins with an opening meeting. This is a good chance for you to confirm any last-minute changes in the details of your company. Make sure the auditor is aware of any critical information. If you're going to have customers by for a visit, if you're going to have someone that's going to be out in the afternoon or whatnot, all good things to share during the opening meeting. From the opening meeting, we will, obviously the audit will be carried out in accordance with the audit plan. The auditor is going to use a PJR Stage 1 workbook. We do have a designated workbook for Stage 1 audits to record the results of their assessments. And just about everything reviewed in the Stage 1 audit is going to be documentation based in nature. It's going to be that list of items that we looked at a few slides ago. Now, the items that are going to be looked at, the auditor is going to be asked to draw one of two conclusions. Either what they're reviewing conforms, or that they've identified a concern. And a concern is going to be anything that represents a disconnect between your implemented process and the related requirements from the applicable standard. Now, once the auditor has completed their review of the materials, they're going to typically need some time to prepare their audit report. Most of the audit plans will show, half an hour, 20 minutes or so for report prep. There are no nonconformances issued in a Stage 1 audit. It's not a certification event, but the idea is that if the concerns are significant enough, we may not be able to continue on to Stage 2. Otherwise, you may be continuing on to Stage 2, but there are some concerns that need to be addressed, or else they may turn into nonconformances at Stage 2. But again, no nonconformances in the context of a Stage 1 itself. So as I mentioned, there are a couple of possible outcomes of the Stage 1. We could recommend to continue to Stage 2 with no concerns. That's the best possible result. We could recommend to continue to Stage 2 with concerns, and we'll go over what some of those concerns might be. And in an extreme case, there may be a recommendation that the Stage 1 audit be repeated. Now, you will be asked to sign an acknowledgement of the Stage 1 results, and you will be given a copy of the audit report itself. Now, obviously, due to travel circumstances and whatnot, it may be a few additional days before you get the actual report, but it is something that you will get for sure. So let's talk about what might prevent continuance to a Stage 2 audit. If you have not done a good job of identifying what your processes are, if your interaction of processes represents the PDCA diagram from the ISO 9001 standard, if you have something canned that you were given by a consultant that bears no resemblance to what your processes are, these are things that can prevent continuance to Stage 2. We encourage you to document an interaction and name processes that are truly your processes. This is your system. It should be reflective of your processes. We do have a webinar for this. We have a separate webinar entitled The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. It is shown every couple of months. I do encourage you to check that presentation out if you've got concerns on your interaction of processes. The interaction of processes is considered the single best indicator that you understand what processes are and that you know what the processes are for your quality system. If the IOP is in bad shape, it's going to raise a lot of questions about the rest of your quality system. Inadequate process measures or process performance data. Both versions of ISO 9001 require you to monitor, measure where applicable, and analyze your processes. So the expectation is that every process on your interaction should be monitored or measured. And you should have performance data available to prove that you're doing this monitoring and measurement. Now, we do have some standards with minimum requirements for the amount of data that has to be available. IATF 16949, for example, requires a year's worth of tracking data. For other standards, ISO 9001 included, we just need enough evidence to show that you have in fact done some monitoring of your processes. We do have a number of clients, these are usually smaller companies, that choose to have just a few measures of effectiveness that cover all processes. That is generally considered to be acceptable. You don't have to have a unique measure per process. You have to be able to explain and show that all of your processes have representation somehow. Another item that can raise problems in continuing to a Stage 2 audit, an inadequate or incomplete internal audit. So what are we looking for when we look for internal audit records? We want to make sure that internal audits are planned. We want to see evidence that all processes and requirements were audited. Sometimes this can be a real issue. The notes are too thin, or we don't see what samples were taken. Nonconformances that were raised and corrective actions that were written to address those nonconformances. Also, obviously, making sure that auditors did not audit their own work. Now, a special note here. We can, in most circumstances, recommend a continuance to stage 2 if there is evidence that the internal audit has been planned in such a way that it will take place prior to the stage 2. So in other words, if we show up for stage 1 and the internal audit has not been done yet, but it's been planned, you have a firm schedule, you have something to show that it will be done prior to stage 2, you can continue to stage 2, but you lose the benefit of getting some initial feedback on that internal audit prior to stage 2. So obviously there's a risk in doing it that way. With internal auditor competency records, these can also raise concerns. Remember that internal auditing is a competency within your system, no different than any other competency. In other words, you are on your own discretion in terms of what makes an internal auditor competent, at least for ISO 9001. Now, there's other standards where there are more specific requirements for auditor competency, and those are going to vary a little bit from scope to scope. But in general, you make the rules for what makes an auditor competent, and then you have to show that your internal audit team meets those criteria. So we are going to ask to see proof that your auditors have fulfilled your competency requirements. Management review. Similar to our approach on internal audit, we look first of all to make sure that all of the inputs and outputs have been addressed. We look to see what was the discussion, what were the outputs. Oftentimes we're given a PowerPoint presentation, and that tells us what was discussed, but it does not tell us the decisions, the actions, and so forth, the outputs of the meeting. Remember that management review is broken up into inputs and outputs, and we need to see evidence of both. Now again, if the management review has not taken place prior to stage 1, but you can show evidence that it's been planned to take place prior to stage 2, we can recommend you continue on to stage 2. However, again, you lose the benefit of a preliminary review of your management review minutes. So again, there is a risk in taking that approach. Now, one of the things that I don't think all of our clients are fully aware of is that the auditor is not the final authority on the results of an audit. You have to remember that when the auditor issues their report, they are issuing a recommendation. The final decision on the report is made by a member of the PJR Executive Committee. And we do review all stage 1 audit reports. We want to make sure that the decisions reached were appropriate and that they were fair. And additionally, as a PJR client, you have the right to issue a dispute or ask for an appeal of an auditor's decision. And that whole process, our dispute and appeal process, is discussed in PJR Procedure Pro 10, which can be downloaded from our website. Now, if the recommendation is to repeat the stage 1 audit, again, this is a very rare output, but it does happen once in a while. We ask that you work from your audit report. Again, you will be given a copy of the audit report as soon as possible. It's going to outline all of those areas that were delinquent and that need your attention, and shore up those areas so that you'll have a better result at the next audit. If the recommendation is to proceed to stage 2, you will typically want to have a minimum of 30 days between stage 1 and stage 2. 60 to 75 days is preferred. Remember that we do have a 21-day cancellation policy. You know, we have to book travel, we have to hold auditors' time. So if you have a stage 1 audit, And then the very next week, you're going to be going for stage 2. You have a stage 1 audit and it doesn't go well. And you say, ooh, we need to push our stage 2 back. Well, now, unfortunately, we're looking at costs associated with that decision. So again, try to have some breathing room, at least 30 days, and preferably 60 to 75 days between stage 1 and stage 2. Use that time to address any areas of concern that were identified. Remember that anything in a stage 1 audit that is left unaddressed is going to likely turn into a nonconformance during stage 2. So for example, if you told us at stage 1 that you are going to conduct your management review meeting prior to stage 2, okay, we'll write it down as a concern, and when we come back for stage 2, if it's still not finished, now we're potentially looking at a major nonconformance. In conclusion, we want our clients to feel confident and comfortable with the stage 1 audit process. We feel that the care that's taken before the stage 1, the support of the auditor, the support of the executive committee, these are going to help you make this process go seamlessly, and that you will have a successful outcome. And we do wish you every success in your certification journey. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. Two I'd like to mention specifically. We do have a 9001 2015 webinar. It's titled Approaching Your Transition with Confidence. It is shown on a semi-monthly basis. We have a lot of content there. We go over new requirements from the standard, lessons learned from our first year of auditing, also from the 9002 guidance standard. I mentioned the interaction of processes presentation a little bit earlier. We have webinars on a lot of other topics: ISO 13485, ISO 14001, ISO 20000, lots of content, lots of great webinar content for you, our clients. And I do also want to invite you to opt in. If you visit our website on the homepage, go to the very bottom, put your email address in the provided space and click subscribe. You'll be opted in for news updates, notice of upcoming webinars, lots of other helpful information. I do thank you for your time, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard here. We have a question from Joseph Smerecker. I'm sure I mispronounced that. I apologize. We are upgrading from 9001 2008 to 2015. This is our recertification. Does stage 1 occur on the first day and stage 2 on the second day? No. As a certified client, you will not be going through a stage 1 audit. You will simply proceed with your recertification audit. The only time you would go through a stage 1 audit would be if you are seeking a new certification or expanding an existing certification to a new site. And I got your name right. Well, how about that? Robert Cornell asks, internal audits. Do audits must exist covering all of 2015 over what period? Well, Mr. Cornell, the expectation in the lead up to a stage 1 audit is that you've done an internal audit of your entire quality management system. Now, as to the time frame for accomplishing that, that's going to be up to you to decide. But again, going into stage 2 especially, you should be able to demonstrate that your entire quality management system was included in the internal audit process. Tom Tufts asks, I am a small shop. How do I audit myself? Well, Tom, typically, if there's at least a couple of employees in the company, you can divvy up the responsibilities. Someone from say the office auditing production and someone from production auditing the office and so forth. You may need to work with a contractor, but again, that we certainly have a number of clients that that run into that situation. Sally Kester, if we become an established client with PJR now, knowing that we won't be ready for stage 1 for several months, will our schedule be available for questions prior to the actual audit? Absolutely, Sally. If we have you under contract, if you have an assigned auditor, even before all of that, yeah, we like to help our clients get through the preliminary phases. We definitely are interested in working with you, growing our relationship with you. We want you to feel comfortable that you've made the right choice with coming to PJR. Joshua Green, can we forward documents to our auditor for review before our audit date? Joshua, certainly you can. As to the auditor making an official audit decision prior to the audit, obviously that would not happen. Some auditors, I know they have a number of things that they like to review in advance of the audit. Really comes down to the individual auditor. Morgan Peterson, what if you have a lot of processes for various things that your organization does? How do you place them in a process interaction map? Is that a requirement? Morgan, it is required that you establish what your processes are. And indeed, we have some companies that have a lot of processes. You don't have to have an interaction map per se, but you do have to be able to establish what your processes are and how they interact with each other. An interaction map is simply the most common way that that's done. Another question from Robert Cornell. What is the internal expectation of internal audits for 2015 if I'm going from 2008 to 2015? Great question. Robert, the expectation is going to be at minimum that you've audited the new requirements, and preferably that you've done a complete redo audit on the new standard against all your processes. But again, that's a transition audit question, not a stage 1 audit question. Are there any further items I can answer today? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Have a great day.